One of the things that is very important is clear roles in the SOPs or the standard operating procedures that are the guidelines that are available should clearly define the different roles of the partners. The other aspect is, of course, coordination among the partners, that the partners need to coordinate for service delivery so that we avoid duplication of resources. You will notice that sometimes the clients are overwhelmed because at every service point, they're asking them to narrate their stories for probably a similar service that they could have got from the other partner.
Gender consideration is very important because depending on age and gender, the risk factors and the vulnerabilities to the exposure to GBV vary. So we need to also take into consideration how boys and girls face different GBV risks, and then also at different ages. In addition to age, we also need to take into consideration the level of maturity of child and adolescent survivors. So this means that depending on the level of emotional and cognitive development of child and adolescent survivors, the extent and also the capacity of child and adolescent survivors to be fully participate in the case management process and also the decision-making process will be determined.
Our work with the children, we have to be conscious about how much can a child of which age bracket disclose, to what extent can they disclose information, especially now that we are dealing with GBV survivors. The best interest of the child principle, which is emphasized in our child protection work, is also important. So what is it that is going to be important for this child? What is it in decisions that are going to be made? Are they in the best interest of the child? And that is all important aspects to consider.
So depending on the context, especially in terms of the laws that certain country has, in terms of age of consent, assent, as well as depending on social cultural norms, the role of parents or caregivers is very big. I think when any decision related to children is being made. So from the service provider's perspective, we need to really ensure to sensitize and also provide support for parents as well as caregivers so that they can be a facilitator for children and adolescents when they make decisions, when they are involved in the case management process, rather than they dominate the decision-making process.
Of course, this in some contexts or in some cases becomes complicated, especially if the parent is the perpetrator. So that sometimes the parent is not going to be the best person to give us permission or consent. And sometimes we are using maybe the welfare committees or the fit persons within the communities to provide the consent for that child. Mandatory reporting requirements may prevent service providers from responding in manners that are appropriate and technical to the child's need or the best interest of the child. The other aspect is, of course, building on strategies and guidelines that are developed for our GBV work and child protection work, which is vital, and strengthening intersectoral approaches among GBV and child protection actors and mental health and PSS actors.
We have heard a lot especially from GBV partners, that they don't have sufficient knowledge and the skills in communicating with child and adolescent survivors at different ages, or they don't feel confident enough to really provide specialized services for child and adolescent survivors. So in this sense, we also need to avail regular and continuous training and also coaching opportunities for both, I think, GBV and the MHPSS actors to feel more comfortable in communicating with and providing support to child and adolescent survivors.